The story of Treaty 5 is an important story for Canada because it shaped the country we know today. In order to understand the importance, you must learn about the faces, the stories, and the history of Treaty 5.
I think it's important to understand the spirit and intent of treaty. One very important aspect is that our people never surrendered or ceded our lands. The intent was to establish partnerships on lands and resources, sharing the wealth. If we can agree on that, it would benefit both parties. That alone would solve the problem as it relates to the lack of implementation of our treaties.
Behind me is old Fort Niagara, where the First Nations came together to agree on the proclamation.
An important aspect of treaty is that it's between two sovereign nations. Recognition of sovereignty is important to First Nations. Each of these parties are independent nations to make a treaty. When we signed Treaty Number 5, we also had governments. We were self-governing peoples. And as soon as we signed the treaty, the settlers did away with our governments. So what they did was they imposed what they called the Indian Act, which set the rules on how we're supposed to govern ourselves to this day.
Well, the treaty, it lives with us. Not only what's written there in that text, you gotta remember that text that's written in there is not everything that was said from our people when they understood treaty and signed treaty. This 150-year anniversary for us, I'm hearing our youth, our educated people, our citizens talking about the understanding of treaty, and treaty lives within us, so it's up to us to exercise our treaty.
The signing of Barons River was a culmination of many requests that the communities had actually asked for. We see from the documentary history as well as the oral stories that have been shared here that communities were increasingly concerned about all the changes that were happening, right? Their financial changes, the economic situation, the ability to work for the Hudson Bay Company, the traditional food sources, all of those things were coming under incredible pressures, as well as the settlers, such as my ancestors who came here in 1874 to Manitoba. And so all of those pressures are coming together and communities begin asking for treaty. At Barons, they actually started asking. They thought they were part of Treaty 1. In many ways, it was always the leadership within each of the communities that was initiating these these relationships. That's what comes out of the documents. And it's not just part of the community knowledge. It comes through in the documents over and over and over again that the Crown really just didn't want to engage unless they felt absolutely pushed and felt that it was a necessary process to engage with. The treaty party from the Crown, the commissioners came. They apparently met for about 7 hours. Documents, when you kind of read them against the grain, you start to ask questions of Alexander Morris's report, such as we had difficult conversations.
Back when Treaty 5 came into existence, 1875, my community did not sign into the original Treaty 5. They came in a year later as an adhesion. I often think about what happened, how did it happen? And I often voice that. I said, just imagine people in our area, the delta of the Saskatchewan River. People were living in different parts of that delta. Cumberland Island, Pine Bluff, Muskeg River, and Budds Point. Today, nobody lives in Budds Point or Muskeg, and the people were moved from Pine Bluff into Cumberland. So we're all living on the island of Ministiguminaikoskak. So I often think to myself, well, the three fellows were picked to go to the paw in September 7th, 1876. to go and sign us into treaty. John Cochrane, Albert Flett, and Peter Chapman. I am a descendant of Albert Flett.
One of the things that happened, I was just focusing on Treaty 5 in northern Manitoba. When the treaty commissioners were going around, the treaties didn't happen right away for the North anyway. The government back in the day didn't think that treaties were important for the North. I think they had this idea that Aboriginal people in the North could just carry on and live out their lives. But I think once they realized that the resources in the North were very valuable and they needed to access the resources, they started thinking about building a railroad. That's when they realized that they needed to, negotiate treaties. Some of our Treaty 5 had already pre-negotiated treaties. Like, for example, my grandfather is from Grand Rapids, and so he was one of the treaty negotiators for Grand Rapids citizens, Chief William Beardy. And so he was my grandfather. So the terms and conditions that they negotiated, like he traveled far to go and seek, the treaty commissioners to make treaty. When he did that, he had to travel far. I believe he went to Fort Capel, Saskatchewan. Of course, our people communicated with each other. So further north, and I'm talking about like the Wahutin area, they were aware that these treaty discussions were going on. So some of the treaty commissioners were, anxious because one of the things that they were told when they came north was they wanted to fast track the treaties. And so that's where the adhesion to Treaty 5 came on. Our people were very, they weren't easily bought, during the negotiations. And like I said, they would go back to their areas and have their own conversations.
The contact or the relationship between the Catholic Church, if you wish, and Indigenous people goes back a long way. It goes back, in essence, to the beginning of the fur trade in this area. For our diocese, that would have meant Hollow Water, Bloodvein, Barons, Little Grand and Pangasi, and Poplar. The church, it was especially through the missionaries called the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and then the sisters, the Grey Nuns, the missionary Oblate sisters. And on the one hand, in the communities, there were missionaries who lived there for a long time with the people, came to learn the language, were part of the community, were, head of the church. Then, of course, with the coming of the treaties and the residential schools, and the Canadian government wanting to do it cheaply and not have a school as was promised on every reserve, but rather gather the children in key places where residential schools were, then that was a whole different chapter. And it's the really painful chapter of taking children away from their families, away from their communities, into a setting that was completely foreign to them.
Well, Wahutin is the relationship, the sacred relationship between people, individuals, nations, etc. So it's part of who we are, it's part of our governance, it's part of just our everyday life, our relationship with not only people, but the land, the animals, the plants, and all this interconnectedness of everything around us. Going into the future and with young people, I think understanding what that means is critically important, and it's a relationship that has to be carried forward under any circumstance. So my ancestors signed the Adhesions to Treaty 5 in York Factory, and my understanding, as explained to me, and was that it was being signed by two different groups of people, Canada on the one hand and the York Factory, the people at York Factory, my ancestors. And that the understanding was that they were signing a document, a covenant, that they were going to share the land, share the resources, and cooperate, and live peacefully together.
I think the spirituality plays a role, for me anyway. My great-great-grandfather who signed Treaty 5, believed that this agreement would help us. This agreement would look after us in the future, and that the spirit continues to be today. Well, Chimawan is the original signatory of Treaty 5. They signed it in Moose Lake, but then, the chief back then chased the commissioner to the paw to make sure that we were separate from Moose Lake.
Sharing speaks to ownership. And this has always been something that has been transferred from one group of people to the next generation. Regardless of which governments came into play, regardless of what circumstances are, it is going to always be the treaties that are going to form the hinge into the future of our people. The people, prior to the signing of the treaty, did not live in a community. The old post where the Island Lake Adhesion was signed, was not a community. It was a summer gathering place. The people lived out in the land. They had their ancestral lands based upon the family clans. The community, Island Lake community, knew about the treaty commissioners coming down. They knew what was in the treaty because we had people that were constantly in transit from Island Lake to God's Lake to Oxford House. And so, and the signings that happened out further into the west in the communities. And one of the things we have learned is that there were certain things that Island Lake people wanted to clarify. And the treaty commissioners there were in a haste, and they said they would come back and complete and answer those questions and so forth. Sarah Harper, when she was in her 80s, mid-80s, visited the community of St. Teresa Point. She recalls the time when she was a little girl, she would have been about 5 years old, that she was there, the signing of the Island Lake Treaty number 5 at the old post. The story goes that they would go back into their ancestral lands. And from time to time, the father and the mother would talk to them about the signing of the treaty and what was committed in that treaty. It was never just something that was said once. It was continually repeated to her and her children. We've always fought for and say is health is a treaty right. Government says, no, it's not a treaty right. It's just a benevolence on our part. When in fact, a doctor, dentists have always been present at every treaty event. Right from the signing, they were there. What about that commissioner that made this promise? Begin to raise questions about it, And it keeps coming back in Island Lake area. Well, they're supposed to come back. They haven't come back yet.
The Sayuji Dene people are, in their language, means people of the East. Land was probably very, very important as other cultures as well. They followed the caribou in the wintertime, and then they would, make camp for the summer at a particular place where there was lots of fish and game to be had. You had two specific groups of caribou that used to come down to their area, which was the Kamaniriak herd and the Beverly herd. Same caribou, but two different herds. And when treaty matters were discussed, or the treaties itself and treaty days, Samagodere covered government as well. I was able to speak with some of the elders from Taduli Lake, the Saisi Dene people, and their understanding and the words they used to describe government was the Samagodere, which means government.
It's a unique history for Black River, because when they came around signing during the treaty process, signing time, we know through our historical research that our leadership of the day, they wanted to negotiate better terms, because they were aware of the Huron treaties, they were aware of the Robinson treaties, that they were allocated much larger land allocations. When the representatives of the Crown came by, they wanted to negotiate terms, so they just bypassed us and kept going north. Then the following year, they came back to Black River, 1876, and they paid our community members, they gave them money. There was no treaty document signed there. So what happened, the representative again selected 3 individuals from our community and brought them to Winnipeg, and they signed the treaty there 4 days later, September 7th, 1876. So that's where we got into the Treaty 5. There used to be a British government's house right where the Can West Global Park is today. They had an office there. That office no longer exists. Treaty 5 the document itself is a living document that needs to be, and it's starting to be revitalized and interpreted by us. And that's one thing that I've learned over the years, is our oral history from our elders telling us the stories of their interpretations of what treaty meant to them is viable in Canadian court of law.
Well, I'd like people to understand that Treaty 5 creates that foundation for us to go forward. We can do these things, in concert with Canada and with Manitoba. Whatever it is that comes along, whether it's industrial development, whether it's services, all those things need to be cohesive within us. I think a lot of spirituality plays into that from our spirits of our grandfathers that signed, Treaty 5. They believed that this will help us in the future. And that's what the spirit, has been for me, to realize that this agreement has helped me in the past and it continues to help me today. Treaty 5 means to me is a legal binding agreement, that defines our relationship, our rights, obligations, and the definition of the land, boundaries.
What they did agree to was to last forever.
We had our own life, and by agreeing to the other party and signing these treaties, we were ensuring that we would continue to maintain that good minupmadsu and that good life. This is what the signers and the forefathers had intended when they did mark their X on the treaties. And so we intend on going forward and living in those promises for as long as the sun shines and the rivers flow and the grass grows. These treaties are forever.
One thing I really don't like is that our people and our elders, I feel like they beg so much from the government for a lot of the things that were supposed to be upheld from the treaty that was signed.
I think that the relationship between all people needs to be one marked by mutual respect and cooperation and listening to one another. And I think we only exist on earth for the sake of our relationships with all our brothers and sisters, with all people. So many of our people just don't really know the history or the significance of the treaties. We're all treaty people, that vision. So a large part of the church's work is to help non-Indigenous know the history, see what's the key matters at hand, and how to walk together.
What I envision is Treaty 5, because there's 40 of us and we're one of the largest populated First Nation treaty area in the country. The rest of the country will see us working well together as a group, as an entity, pushing common issues forward for our 40 nations. Then it'll branch out to the rest of the country. They'll say, hey, look what they're doing there.
In order to understand Treaty 5, it's important to learn about the people, about the stories, and about where we want to go in the future, together.